$100,000. Bradford Whitmore peeled the bills off a roll thick as a hymn book and let them fan across the white tablecloth, slow, so the whole dining room could count them. $100,000, cash, says this one right here can't speak 2 words of Chinese. He pointed at her without looking at her, the way a man points at a coat rack. Look at her. Go on, girl. Say something. Prove me wrong. The room went quiet the way a room goes quiet before something breaks. Della set the water pitcher down on the side stand. She did not flinch. She folded her hands at her waist, the way her mother-in-law had taught her to stand 30 years ago, and she looked Bradford Whitmore dead in the eyes, calm as still water on a windless morning. At her throat hung a small pendant of green jade, warm from her skin, and her thumb found it the way a person finds a familiar door in the dark. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. A waiter stood frozen with a tray of creme brulee, the little flames still hissing. He had no idea who she was. He had no idea what she had buried, what she had carried for 32 years, or what was carved into the green stone at her throat. In 4 minutes, Bradford Whitmore would lose far more than $100,000. Have you ever been measured by a uniform you were wearing? By the color of your skin, by the speed at which the world decided you were small? Then you already know the silence Della was standing in. Let me take you back. 3 hours earlier, before any of them knew her name. The morning began, as Della's mornings always began, in the dark. She woke at 4:50 before the alarm, the way the body learns to wake when it has been waking at the same hour for years. The radiator clanked twice and gave up. She lay still a moment under 2 blankets and listened to the building breathe, the pipes. The upstairs neighbor's footsteps, the rain that had been falling on the city of Hartwell for 3 days straight. Then she swung her feet to the cold floor, because the morning would not wait, and neither would the boy. The apartment was small and clean, and it smelled like the candle she lit each night for David. 2 rooms and a kitchen the size of a closet. A blue tarp was nailed across the corner of the ceiling above the stove, sagging a little with water, because the landlord had been promising to fix the roof since October, and it was March now. Della emptied the bucket beneath it into the sink, the way she did every morning, and set it back. Drip, drip, she had stopped hearing it months ago. On the windowsill above the radiator stood a photograph in a dime store frame, a man with kind eyes and a gap-toothed smile, his arm around a younger Della in a yellow dress. David Lynn. 8 years gone. The frame was cheap, but the glass was always clean because she wiped it every morning with the hem of her sleeve before she did anything else. "Morning, baby," she said to it soft, the way you greet someone who is still in the next room. Then she went to wake her grandson. Eli was 9 years old and slept the way only children and the truly innocent sleep, flung sideways, the blanket on the floor, 1 sock on. He had come to live with her 2 years ago after the accident took his mother, Della's daughter Renee, on a wet road much like the ones outside the window now. Della did not talk about that morning. She had decided, the day the social worker brought the boy to her door with a garbage bag of his things, that this child would not grow up in a house of grief. He would grow up in a house of breakfast and clean shirts and somebody saying his name like it was good news. "Up, baby," she said, and rubbed his back. "Up, the world's waiting on you." She made him oatmeal with brown sugar and cut a banana into it in coins. She packed his lunch in a brown paper bag and folded the top down twice and wrote Eli on it in marker with a little star, because he was at the age where he pretended the star embarrassed him and would have been heartbroken if it ever stopped appearing. While he ate, she ironed her uniform on the kitchen table, the black dress, the white apron, the collar, pressing it slow and careful, the way you press something that matters, the way her mother-in-law had once pressed a wedding dress. The uniform was old. She had mended the left cuff twice, but when Della Lynn walked into a room, no one was going to be able to say she did not take pride in herself. That was the one thing the world could never garnish. They walked to the bus stop together under one umbrella, the boy's hand in hers, and she handed him off at the school gate with a kiss he wiped away and a "be somebody's friend today" he pretended not to hear. Then she stood at the stop on Vance Street in the gray light and waited for the number 12, and rode it 40 minutes across the river into the part of Hartwell where the buildings had doormen and the street lights were gold instead of orange. Her hourly wage was $9.20. She made the rest in tips. which meant she made the rest by being invisible in exactly the right way. Present when you wanted water, gone when you wanted to be alone, smiling without ever seeming to ask for anything. She had been at the Marquette for 6 years. The Marquette was the kind of restaurant where a glass of wine cost more than she spent on groceries in a day, where the tablecloths were Belgian linen and the maitre d' wore a tie that cost $200, where men closed deals worth more than her whole life over plates of seared scallops and never once learned the name of the woman who set them down. But here is what those men did not know. The woman in the mended cuff, the woman they called Miss and Honey and sometimes nothing at all, the woman who refilled their water and cleared their bread plates. That woman could read Tang Dynasty poetry in the original. She could write her own name in 3 forms of Chinese calligraphy with a brush so steady the ink never trembled. She had spent 11 years as a certified medical interpreter at Hartwell General, sitting with frightened Chinese families in the worst hours of their lives, turning a doctor's hard words into something a mother could survive hearing. She had once stood in a courtroom and interpreted a man's testimony so faithfully that the judge thanked her by name. She had a daughter-in-law's name carved in jade at her throat and 1,000 poems in her chest, and she had folded all of it down small and quiet and put it away, because life had asked her to. And Della Lynn did what life asked. She thought about David on the bus. She always did, crossing the river. She thought about the autumn day in 1987 when a tall young man with a gap-toothed smile had held the door of a Hartwell bookstore for her, and then, seeing the book in her hands, a beginner's Mandarin primer she'd bought with money she didn't have, had asked, in delighted disbelief, why a girl from the east side of Hartwell was teaching herself Chinese. Because the world is bigger than this block, she'd told him, and I intend to see it. He had laughed like she'd handed him a gift. They were married 14 months later in a church on her side of the river and a tea ceremony on his, and his mother had wept at both. David's mother, Lin Yuhua. Della had called her Emma from the second week. Emma Lin had come to America at 51 with a husband who died too soon and a son who was all she had left, and a wooden box of brushes and inkstones that she guarded like the crown jewels. In China she had been a school teacher and a calligrapher of some local renown. In Hartwell she pressed shirts in a laundry on Delancey for $11 a day and never once complained. Because complaining, she said, was a way of telling heaven you knew better than it did. She had decided, against all the unwritten rules of the neighborhoods both women came from, to love her son's wife. And she had decided that this clever, hungry, big-eyed girl who wanted to see the world was going to learn to see it properly, which meant learning to read. So for 30 years, at the kitchen table, after the dishes, Ma Lin taught Della. Tones first, the 4 little melodies that turned one sound into 4 words, until Della stopped hearing them as music and started hearing them as meaning. Then, characters, radicals, strokes, the order they must be drawn in, because a character drawn in the wrong order, Ma said, was like a life lived in the wrong order. It might look the same to a fool, but it would never hold ink right. Then the poems. Li Bai, Du Fu Wang Wei, the old, clear, aching poems about moonlight and rivers and missing home. And one more thing. On the night before her wedding, Ma Lin had pressed something into Della's hand and closed her fingers over it. A pendant of green jade, river smooth, carved with the small 5-petaled shape of a plum blossom and a single character beneath it. Me, Plum Blossom. This is your name now, Ma had said. In our family you are Mi. Do you know why the plum blossom? And when Della shook her head, the old woman had said the line Della would carry for the rest of her life. The line she would whisper to herself on the worst mornings. The line that was, in the end, the truest description of the woman herself. Mi Hu sings Kan Li. The plum blossom blooms in the dead of winter. Its fragrance, she touched Della's chest, over the heart, comes only from the bitter cold. David died of pancreatic cancer in a year that ate their savings the way a fire eats a field, fast at the edges, total at the center. The medical bills did what the diagnosis started. Lin had passed 2 years before him, in her sleep with a brush still drying on the table. By the time it was over, Della was 61 years old, a widow. A grandmother raising a grieving boy, and the 11-year interpreter career she'd built had been quietly hollowed out by hospital budget cuts that replaced human interpreters with a tablet on a rolling stand. So she had ironed her old black dress, Anne pinned on her name, and taken the only steady work the riverside of the city would give a woman her age. She did not consider it a come-down. She considered it Tuesday. There was a boy who needed shoes. She tucked the pendant inside her collar before she clocked in, the way she always did, so it lay warm and hidden against her breastbone. It was nobody's business but hers. This was the woman Bradford Whitmore would point at, 3 hours later, like a coat rack. But what Bradford Whitmore did not know, what no one in that gleaming room could have guessed, was that the most powerful person at the market that night would not be the millionaire with the roll of cash. And the clock on that fact had already started to tick. The man who would point at her arrived at 6:40 that evening in a car worth more than the building Della lived in. Bradford Whitmore III was 38 years old and had never in his life been told no by anyone who could afford to mean it. His grandfather had built Whitmore Holdings out of post-war concrete and political favors. His father had grown it into the company that owned, by various names, a third of the Hartwell waterfront, 2 shopping centers, and the very office tower the Marquette sat beneath. Bradford III had inherited the corner office, the membership cards, the jaw, and a bone-deep certainty that the world was divided into people who mattered and people who brought you things. He tipped well when he was watched, and not at all when he wasn't. He had been thrown out of exactly 0 establishments in his life, because his name was on the lease of half of them. Tonight was supposed to be the biggest night of his career. For 2 years he had been chasing a $400 million deal, a joint development on the old rail yards, Whitmore land and foreign capital, the project that would finally make him something other than his father's son. The capital was Chinese. The men who controlled it had flown 11 hours to look Bradford in the eye before they signed. Because that was how their chairman did business, he did not invest in spreadsheets, he invested in people. The signing was set for 9 o'clock, upstairs after dinner. All Bradford had to do was get through one meal without embarrassing himself. Vincent, the Marquette's maître d', met the party at the door with the particular oiled warmth he reserved for men who could end his career. He had given them the corner banquet, the 8-top under the tall windows, the best table in the house, and he had made one small staffing decision that he would regret for the rest of his life. The Marquette's senior server, the one who usually handled the corner banquet, had called in with a sick child. So Vincent, glancing across the floor, had assigned the table to the most reliable, most invisible, most unfailingly composed server he had. He assigned it to Della. "Big night, table 4, he murmured to her at the pass, not quite meeting her eyes. "Mr. Whitmore, you know the type. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't bring the check till he asks, and for God's sake don't bring him anything to think about." He straightened her collar without permission, a thing he would never have done to a younger woman, and Della let him, because the boy needed shoes. "Just be furniture," Vincent said. "Pretty furniture." "Yes, Vincent," Della said, and picked up the water pitcher. The Chinese delegation was 4 men and 1 elderly gentleman who sat at the head of the table and said almost nothing. He was small and very still, in a gray suit without a single crease, with white hair combed straight back and a pair of reading glasses he kept folded in his breast pocket. His name was Zhou Wenliang, and he was the chairman of the investment group, and the $400 million belonged, in the end, to him. He had built his fortune across 50 years and 3 industries, and he had buried a wife and a brother, and somewhere along that long road he had learned to do the one thing money cannot buy. He had learned to watch. He watched the way Bradford spoke to the valet. He watched the way Bradford spoke to Vincent. He had a theory, old Joe, that you could learn everything you needed to know about a man not from how he treated his equals, but from how he treated the person pouring his water. He had been at the table 4 minutes when the woman in the black dress came to fill his glass, and he had thanked her, quietly, in English, a small nod, and she had returned it with a small nod of her own. And something in the calm of her had made him look at her twice. Bradford had not looked at her once. This is the part I need you to hold on to. Go back, when you watch this again, to the first moment Bradford Whitmore's eyes crossed Della's face. Watch his eyes. They slide right off her, the way your eyes slide off a lamp. He does not see a woman. He does not see a widow, a grandmother, a scholar, a Lin. He sees a uniform carrying a pitcher. That blindness is the whole story. That blindness is about to cost him $400 million, and he is going to hand it over himself with both hands, smiling, because Bradford Whitmore was about to do the thing that arrogant men have done since the beginning of the world. He was about to mistake quiet for empty. The dinner went wrong the way these things always go wrong, slowly, then all at once. Bradford ordered for the table without asking in a loud voice, the way a man orders when he wants the room to hear what he can afford. He sent back the first bottle of wine, a Burgundy that cost $300, declaring it corked, though it was not. Because sending wine back was a way of showing the foreign money that he was a man of refinement. He told a story about a senator. He told a story about a yacht. He laughed at his own stories a half-beat before the punchlines, and the 4 younger Chinese men laughed politely, and old Joe did not laugh at all. He watched. Della worked the table the way she worked every table, quietly, completely, perfectly. She anticipated the water before it was empty. She cleared from the right and served from the left. She caught the youngest delegate eyeing the breadbasket and brought a fresh one without being asked, and he thanked her in careful English, and she smiled. She did everything right. And the more right she did it, the more invisible she became to Bradford, until invisibility curdled, as it does in men like him, into the urge to step on the thing he could not see. It started when the second bottle came. "You," Bradford said, snapping 2 fingers without turning his head. "Sweetheart, this one better not be corked." He held his glass up and swirled it and made a show of sniffing. Della stood with the bottle and waited. "Well? Don't just stand there. You think I'm paying these prices to pour my own wine?" She poured. A perfect pour, no drip, the label turned out. He did not say thank you. He said, "To the table, you've got to watch them, or they'll water it down." "I've seen it." He smiled. The delegate's smiles went thin. Zhou Wenliang set down his chopsticks. It might have ended there. An ugly man being ugly, a bad night, a small tip. It might have. But then Bradford, reaching for his glass, knocked the salt cellar, and as Della stepped in smooth and silent to right it and blot the cloth, the small green pendant slipped from her collar and swung free at her throat, catching the candlelight. Bradford saw it. And Bradford, who had spent his whole life appraising the value of things at a glance, decided in an instant that he understood it. "What's that?" he said. Not a question. He pointed his fork. "That little, what is that, jade?" He laughed. A short bark. "You buy that off a cart? Chinatown special? $10? He looked around the table for laughter and found only stillness. And the stillness made him push. He always pushed. "It is, isn't it? It's a knockoff." He leaned back. "Let me give you some free advice, honey. When you're working a room with real money in it," he gestured at the delegation, at himself, "you don't wear costume jewelry. It's embarrassing. For everyone." "It was a gift," Della said. 3 words. Calm, the first words she had spoken to him all night. Something about her calm, about the steadiness of it, the way it did not beg, set him off. Men like Bradford can forgive being hated. They cannot forgive being unbothered. A gift. He said it like it was funny. From who? And before she could answer, he reached out and hooked one finger under the cord at her throat and pulled the pendant up off her chest to look at it. The way you'd lift a dog's tag, his knuckle against her collarbone, close enough that she could smell the wine on him. The whole table went rigid. The youngest delegate said something low and urgent in Chinese. Bradford didn't hear it. He turned the little stone in the candlelight, squinting at the character carved beneath the blossom. "What's this say?" He flicked it with his thumbnail. "This Chinese? This say made in Taiwan?" He laughed again, alone now, and that was when the wine and the contempt and the 2 years of pressure and the need to be the biggest man in the room all came together in him and made him do the thing that crossed the line. He pulled, to read it, he'd say later, just to see it, and the old silk cord, 32 years old. worn soft against Della's skin every single day for 32 years, did what 32-year-old silk does. It snapped. The pendant dropped. It struck the edge of his bread plate with a small clean sound like a single piano note and bounced, and Della's hand shot out faster than her dignity wanted it to, but not fast enough. And the green stone skittered off the white linen and over the edge of the table and fell to the marble floor of the marquette, and a piece of it, a small bright chip from one petal of the plum blossom, broke away and spun off under the next table and was gone. The sound it made on the marble was very small. In Della's chest it was the loudest sound in the world. For 1 full second she did not move. 30 years at a kitchen table. A laundry on Delancey. A woman with ink under her nails closing Della's young fingers over a piece of green stone the night before her wedding. The plum blossom blooms in the dead of winter. Its fragrance comes only from the bitter cold. All of it, on the floor of a restaurant, in pieces. Because a man who had everything wanted, for one moment, to feel like he had a little more. Bradford glanced at it on the floor and waved his hand. "Relax. It's worth $10. He picked up his wine. And then, because he had felt the temperature of the table drop, and did not understand why, because he needed to win the room back. Because he was the kind of man who, having stepped on something, decides the thing to do is stamp, he set down his glass and reached into his jacket and brought out the roll of cash. Tell you what. He raised his voice now, for the whole dining room peeling off bills, since we're all so sensitive about Chinese culture tonight. He laughed at his own joke. $100,000. The bills fanned across the cloth. 100 grand cash, says this one right here can't speak 2 words of Chinese. He pointed at her without looking at her, the way a man points at a coat rack. Look at her. Go on, girl, say something. Prove me wrong. And the room went quiet the way a room goes quiet before something breaks. You have seen this moment now from both ends. You have stood where Della stood, with the green stone on the floor and the whole bright room waiting for her to be small. Here is what you could not see from the doorway 3 hours ago, and what Bradford Whitmore would have given $400 million to have known 1 minute sooner. She knelt. Slowly, with the grace of a woman who has knelt to gather harder things than this. Della Lynn bent down in her mended black dress and picked up the broken pendant off the marble floor and closed it in her hand and stood back up to her full height. And then she opened her mouth. But before you hear what she said, you have to understand what that man had actually done. Because Bradford Whitmore thought he had insulted a waitress. He had no idea he had just laid hands on the holiest thing a woman could carry. Let me tell you about the kitchen table on Delancey Street. For 30 years, 3 or 4 nights a week, after David was asleep and the dishes were dried and stacked, 2 women sat at that table under a single hanging bulb and did the slow, patient work of handing a whole world from one heart to another. Lynn would set out the felt mat and the inkstone and grind the ink herself in small circles because ink from a bottle, she said, had no soul. She would dip the brush and hold Della's hand around it, a black girl from the east side of Hartwell and an old Chinese widow from a province whose name most Americans couldn't pronounce, and together they would draw the character for person, and the character for heart, and the character for to endure. Arn ex Sin Arn Ma taught her that the character for to endure is a knife resting on top of a heart, and that this was not a tragedy but a truth, that the people who endure are the ones who can carry the blade and keep the heart beating underneath it anyway. She taught her the poems last, when she judged the girl was ready to be trusted with them, the way you don't hand a child a sharp thing until the hands are steady. She taught her Li Bai, who wrote of the moon over 1,000 years ago and whose moon is still the moon. She taught her the poem that every Chinese child learns first and understands last. 20 syllables about a man far from home who looks up at the moonlight on the floor and mistakes it, for one heartbroken second, for frost, and lifts his head to the moon and lowers it and thinks of home. Lin could not recite that poem without her voice catching on the last word, Gigzing, hometown, the place across the ocean she would never see again. And she taught Della to read it the old way, slow, with the small breath before the final line that her own mother had taught her, in a village schoolroom 80 years before on the other side of the earth. When you say it like this, Ma told her, you are not reading my words. You are letting my mother speak through your mouth. And when you teach it to your children, I will speak through yours. This is how we do not die. That is what was carved into the green stone, not made in Taiwan. A lineage, a chain of women teaching women across 100 years and an ocean, ending, or so the world believed. In a brown paper bag with a little star on it and a number 12 bus. And it had not ended there, because Della had made sure of it. When Emma Lynn died in her sleep with a brush still drying on the table, she left behind a stack of rice paper, 40 poems she had been translating into English by hand in her careful schoolteacher's print, so that her American grandchildren, Della's children, could one day read in their own language the things their grandmother loved. The work was unfinished. 12 of the 40 were only half done, and Della Lynn, who was grieving her mother-in-law and would within 2 years be grieving her husband, sat down at that same kitchen table night after night and finished them. She matched Emma's hand. She matched Emma's meaning. She labored over a single line about plum blossoms for 3 weeks. And when it was done, she took it to a copy shop on the corner and had 50 copies bound in cheap blue cardstock, and she gave them to family, and to the church, and to the 2 old men at the Chinese Cultural Center who had known Ma, and she kept the original rice paper in a drawer wrapped in a pillowcase. She never sold one. She never put her name on the cover larger than Ma's. It was not a career, it was a candle she lit so a voice would not go out. This was the woman Bradford Whitmore had pointed at like a coat rack, a woman who had spent her life being a bridge, between languages, between a doctor and a dying man's family, between the living and the dead, between a village in China and a paper bag with a star on it. A woman who had buried her teacher, her husband, and her daughter, and gotten up the next morning each time to make oatmeal, because a boy needed breakfast and complaining was a way of telling heaven you knew better than it did. Calm is not the absence of fire. Sometimes calm is what fire looks like after it has burned for 60 years and learned exactly what it is for. So when Della knelt on that marble floor and picked up the broken pieces of Emma Lean's gift and stood back up to her full height, she was not deciding whether to answer. She had already decided a long time ago who she was going to be in rooms like this one. She was only deciding which words to say first. She looked at Bradford Whitmore, and she thought of the very first idiom Ma Lean ever taught her. Taught her, in fact, the night a customer at the laundry had spoken to the old woman like she was stupid because her English was poor. Ma had waited for the door to close and then said the words to Della, fierce and quiet, and made her repeat them until she had them. An old saying, the kind every Chinese person knows in the bone. A person cannot be judged by their appearance, the saying goes, just as the sea cannot be measured with a cup. Now go back, for a moment, to the table, to old Zhou Venliang, the man with $400 million and the habit of watching the person who pours the water. He had set down his chopsticks when Bradford snapped his fingers. He had stiffened when the younger delegate murmured his warning. He had watched the green stone fall, and he had watched the woman's face when it broke, and in 50 years of reading faces across negotiating tables, he had never seen grief held so still. He did not yet know who she was, but he knew, the way old men know weather, that the most important thing that would happen in this room tonight was about to come out of that woman's mouth, and that the loud young man with the cash had no idea the floor had already opened under his feet. Bradford was still smiling, still holding out the bills. "We're waiting, sweetheart," and Della Lynn took a breath, the small breath before the final line, the one Emma taught her. And she began to speak. She did not raise her voice. That was the first thing. The whole room leaned in to hear her, and what they heard was not the broken, halting tourist Chinese Bradford expected, the 2 clumsy words he'd bet would never come. What came out of Della Lynn was Mandarin so clean, so fluent, so effortlessly cultured that it stopped the breath in the throats of every native speaker at that table. "Xinsheng," she began, sir, and the word landed soft and perfect, the tones rising and falling like a thing she had been born inside of. She spoke for perhaps 15 seconds, To the room it was music in a language they didn't know. To the 5 Chinese men at table 4 it was an earthquake. Because she was not stammering for the dictionary, she was speaking the elegant, formal, lightly literary Chinese of a thoroughly educated woman, the kind you hear from a retired professor, and she was saying, gently, with no anger in it at all, a person cannot be judged by their appearance. The sea cannot be measured with a cup. You have wagered a great deal of money, sir, on a thing you decided you already knew. Allow me to return your money's worth. The youngest delegate's hand went to his mouth. The man beside him said a word in Chinese that meant, roughly, impossible, and at the head of the table, Chairman Zhou Venliang slowly took his folded reading glasses out of his breast pocket, as if he wanted to see her more clearly, as if he could not quite believe his ears and needed his eyes to vote. Bradford's smile was still on his face, but it had begun to come apart at the edges, the way a smile does when the brain behind it stops sending it instructions. Yeah, okay, he said. Anyone can memorize that's a party trick. That's nothing. His voice had climbed half an octave. That's not even. Say something real. So she said something real. She did not look at him while she said it. She looked instead at the broken pendant in her open palm, at the plum blossom with its missing petal, and she began, in that same slow cultured Mandarin, to recite. 20 syllables, 8 to 10 centuries old. The first poem every Chinese child learns and the last one they understand. She read it the old way an old woman taught her at a kitchen table under a single bulb. She took the small breath before the final line. Moonlight before my bed, I took it for frost on the ground. I lift my head and look at the bright moon. I lower my head and think of home. Sing. And think of home. And the room came apart. The youngest delegate was crying, openly, without shame, the way a grown man cries when he is suddenly 9 years old and his grandmother is alive again for the length of a poem. The man beside him pressed a napkin to his eyes. And Chairman Zhou, the man who held $400 million and the habit of watching, rose from his chair. He stood, a small old man in a gray suit, standing in a fine restaurant, looking at a waitress in a mended black dress as though she were the most important person who had ever poured his water, which, it turned out, she was. He said something to her in Chinese, low and reverent, his voice not entirely steady. He asked her, anyone could hear the question in it even without the words, where? Where did you learn to read it like that? Who taught you to take that breath? And Della Lin, in Mandarin, answered him. My husband's mother taught me, she said. Len Yu, a schoolteacher and a calligrapher. She carried it across the ocean and she put it into my mouth so it would not die. This, she lifted the broken green stone, was her gift. She named me, Plum Blossom, because the plum blossom blooms in the dead of winter and its fragrance comes only from the bitter cold. The chairman put his hand over his heart. And then Zhou Venliang did a thing that no one in the Marquette had ever seen a man like him do. He bowed to her. A deep, formal, unmistakable bow, the kind reserved for a teacher, for an elder, for someone of true worth. The way. Della would think later, a knight kisses the hand of a queen, and the 4 men at his table rose and bowed with him, and then it spread. The couple at the next table, who had been listening, who had watched the stone break and skitter and a piece of it land at their own feet, stood up. Then the table beyond them. A woman at the bar put down her glass and stood. An old waiter, 50 years on his feet, stood at the pass with tears running into the lines of his face and did not wipe them. One by one, then in a wave, the entire dining room of the Marquette rose from their chairs and stood. For the waitress, for the poem, for the green stone, for every person who had ever been pointed at like a coat rack and decided to be a bridge anyway. They did not applaud. It was quieter and bigger than applause. They simply stood, the whole room on their feet, for Della Lin, and in the center of all of it, the only person still sitting was Bradford Whitmore. The color was leaving his face. You could watch it go. He had gone from red to pale to a sort of gray-white, the white of a man who has just understood all at once. The exact size of his mistake. The $100,000 sat fanned and forgotten on the cloth in front of him. The chairman whose signature he needed, the man he had flown across the world to charm, the man worth $400 million, was on his feet bowing to the woman Bradford had called sweetheart and girl and $10 of costume jewelry. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time in his life, Bradford Whitmore III had nothing anyone wanted, in a room full of people, and every single one of them was standing, and none of them were standing for him. Here is the thing about that $100,000. Bradford had said it to humiliate her. He never imagined he would have to pay it. But a bet made in front of 100 witnesses, with the cash already on the table, is not a joke anymore. It is a debt. Chairman Joe straightened from his bow and turned at last to look at Bradford Whitmore, and when he spoke in English, flawless, unhurried English, which he had understood the entire evening, every word, including girl, including sweetheart, including $10 of costume jewelry. "You made a wager," Joe said quietly, $100,000 that this woman could not speak 2 words of Chinese. He let the silence stretch. "She has spoken many. The whole room is your witness. I believe you owe her the money." Bradford's mouth worked. That was obviously a figure of a man's word, Joe said. "Is the only collateral I have ever cared about." He picked up his coat. The 4 delegates were already rising. "I flew across the world, Mr. Whitmore, to learn whether I could trust you with $400 million of other people's savings. I have my answer. I learned it before the soup." He buttoned his coat. "It is a very old idea where I come from. You watch how a man treats the person who can do nothing for him. That tells you how he will treat you the moment you can do nothing for him either." He looked at the cash on the table. "Pay her. And do not contact my office again." He left. The deal Bradford had chased for 2 years, the project that was going to make him something other than his father's son, walked out the door of the Marquette in a gray suit and did not look back. $400 million. Gone in the length of a poem. Remember the 4 minutes I promised you at the start? That was them. And here is what Bradford did not know, what he could not have known, because he never once looked at the people around him. 3 tables away, a 22-year-old busboy named Marcus had taken out his phone the moment Bradford lifted the pendant off Della's neck. Marcus had been bussing at the Marquette for 8 months. He had watched men like Bradford humiliate the staff 100 times and done nothing. Because he needed the job, because you keep your head down, because that is what you learn. But something about the green stone hitting the floor had moved his hand to his pocket before his fear could stop it. He filmed all of it. The bet. The bow. The whole room rising. Della reciting the poem with the broken pendant in her open palm. He posted it that night with 7 words. She picked it up and stood taller. By morning it had 4 million views. By the end of the week it had 90. People who did not speak a syllable of Chinese wept at a poem they could not understand, because they understood the woman, and they understood the man, and they understood in the marrow the exact shape of being measured by a uniform and found small. The hashtag wrote itself. Hashtag stand for Della. They translated the poem in the comments. They translated the idiom. A linguistics professor made a video explaining that the Chinese Della spoke was not merely fluent but beautiful, the register of the highly educated, and that the way she had read the Li Bai was a vanishing classical style most native speakers could no longer produce. A Chinese news program ran the clip, in Beijing and Shanghai and 100 smaller cities. People shared the video of the American grandmother who carried Li Bai across an ocean, and they called her Losh Teacher, and they meant it. The internet, which can be a mob, was for one bright week something better. It went looking for the rest of the story. And the rest of the story was not good for Bradford Whitmore. The valet came forward first, the one Bradford had screamed at in the parking lot, on camera a year before over a scratch that turned out to be on a different car. Then a former assistant who described 2 years of the things that do not make it into press releases. Then a contractor Whitmore Holdings had stiffed on a finished job who had a lawyer and now suddenly an audience. The pattern that money had papered over for a decade came up all at once into the light. It turned out that a man who treats the person pouring his water like furniture has generally been treating a great many people like furniture, and that all of them remember. Whitmore Holdings put out a statement about an unfortunate incident and deeply held values of respect. No one believed it. The Chinese partnership was the third largest piece of the company's growth, and it was dead, and the financial press said so in numbers. The board of Whitmore Holdings met in an emergency session. Bradford III, who had a corner office because of his last name, discovered that a last name is a thing that can be taken back. His own father, Bradford Sr., who had spent 50 years building a name and was not about to watch his son spend it in 1 week, moved to have him removed from any public-facing role pending review. The review did not end. Bradford was given a title with no telephone and an office with no floor staff, which is the corporate way of telling a man to leave without paying him to. And the $100,000? He paid it. His lawyers advised him there was no version of fighting it that did not make the video worse. And the video could always get worse. The check cleared into Della Lynn's account 11 days after the night at the Marquette, the largest number she had ever seen attached to her own name, a number with no business being there. A number that would have covered the medical bills that took her savings and the roof the landlord never fixed and Eli's shoes for the next 10 years. She did not spend it on any of those things. But I'm getting ahead of the story. As for the Marquette, Vincent the Maitre d', who had straightened her collar without permission and told her to be pretty furniture, was let go within the month. Not for the night itself, exactly, but because the restaurant's owner, a woman named Patrice who had been in Europe that week and came home to find her restaurant the most famous one in the country, for all the wrong then right reasons, sat down and watched the security footage and the phone footage side by side, and then watched the way her floor staff flinched whenever certain names came up in the reservation book, and understood that the rot was older than one bad night. She rebuilt the staff handbook from the first page. She instituted a rule, half joking and entirely serious, that the senior staff would call her Patrice the way they called the dishwashers by name. And she went looking for Della to apologize and to offer her any job in the house she wanted. But Della Lynn was not coming back to wait tables. Della Lynn had somewhere else to be. 1 year later, on a Saturday morning, on the east side of Hartwell, there is a storefront on Delancey Street where a laundry used to be. The sign in the window is hand-painted because Della insisted, and it reads in English and in Chinese, Plum Blossom House. Inside, the tables are long and plain and there are felt mats laid out on them, and inkstones and brushes in jars and the smell of ground ink that has no soul if it comes from a bottle. On Saturday mornings, the room is full of children. Children from the neighborhood, children whose grandparents came from a dozen different countries. Children who would otherwise never in their lives hold a brush, and they are learning to draw the character for person, and the character for heart, and the character for to endure, which is a knife resting on top of a heart. And the people who endure are the ones who can carry the blade and keep the heart beating anyway. The $100,000 started it. Della did not keep $1 of it for herself. She used it to sign the lease and buy the tables and the brushes, and she named the place for the only fortune she had ever truly owned. Chairman Zhou heard what she had done, and Chairman Zhou, who had not forgotten the poem or the bow, endowed the rest. A foundation, properly funded, so that the classes would always be free and there would always be enough brushes. He did one more thing, too. He found the 50 blue-bound copies of Emma Malin's translated poems, the ones Della had printed at a copy shop and never put her name on, and he had them published beautifully in hardcover, the original Chinese and the English side by side. Lin Yuho's name on the cover and Della Lynn's just beneath it, translator. It sold out its first printing in a week. The proceeds go to the school. Somewhere an old woman who pressed shirts for $11 a day is a published author across 2 languages, because a girl from the East Side learned to take the small breath before the final line and refused to let a voice go out. Marcus, the busboy who took out his phone when his fear told him not to, does not bus tables anymore. He runs the front desk at Plum Blossom House and is finishing a degree at night on a scholarship the foundation pays for, and he is learning Mandarin himself, slowly, badly, joyfully, in the beginner's class, where Della corrects his tones with the exact patience an old woman once used on her. And Eli is 10 now, and he can recite the poem about the moonlight all the way through, in Chinese with the small breath before the last line, and when he gets to sing, think of home, he does not yet understand it. Because he is 10, and that is exactly right, he will understand it later. They always do. That is how they do not die. The pendant hangs at Della's throat where it always has. She took it to a jeweler, and she did not ask him to hide the break. She asked him to fill the missing petal with a thin seam of gold so that the line of the wound runs bright across the green stone, because some things are not made whole by pretending they were never broken. Some things are made holy by it. The plum blossom blooms in the dead of winter. Its fragrance comes only from the bitter cold. As for Bradford Whitmore, there is not much more to tell, and that is its own kind of justice. He is not in prison. Men like Bradford rarely are. But the corner office is gone, and the name does not open the doors it used to, and the last anyone heard he had moved to another city to try to be somebody where the video was not the first thing that came up beside his face. It follows him anyway. It will follow him a long time. Somewhere out there, a man who once bet $100,000 that a woman was nothing is learning, slowly. In the only school that ever teaches that particular lesson, that the world had been telling him the truth the whole time, in a language he never bothered to learn, a person cannot be judged by their appearance, and the sea cannot be measured with a cup. The children at Plum Blossom House do not know any of that. They only know that on Saturday mornings there is a woman with kind eyes and a gold-seamed stone at her throat who teaches them to make something beautiful with a brush, and who tells them when their hands shake that the shaking is allowed and the heart underneath it is what matters, and that they are, every single one of them, the quiet ones especially, somebody. They believe her. They are right to. If this story moved you even a little, do one small thing for Della and for the woman who taught her, like this video. Share it with one person who needs to be reminded what they're worth. And subscribe, because there are more of these, more quiet people the world decided were small, more rooms that ended up on their feet. And before you go, answer me this honestly in the comments. When was the last time someone decided who you were before you opened your mouth? And what did you wish you'd said? But here's what really gets me. Here's the part I can't stop thinking about. It was never about the Chinese. Bradford didn't lose $400 million because a woman could speak a language. He lost it because for his whole life he had only ever learned to read one thing, what a person could do for him, and he had gotten so good at reading that one thing that he forgot there was anything else written on a human face. Della read everyone, the frightened families at the hospital, the lonely customers at the market, a grieving boy at her kitchen table. That was her real fluency. Not the poem, the people. And the terrible simple truth underneath this whole story is that the man who could afford anything was the poorest person in that room. Because he had never once in his life learned how to see somebody who couldn't pay. So here is my real question, the one I actually want you to sit with tonight. Not whether you've been the one who got overlooked. We've all been Della, standing in the quiet, swallowing it. The harder question is the other one. Think of the last person who poured your water, carried your bag, cleaned your table, cleared your tray, the one you looked through. Did you see their face? Do you remember it now? Tell me in the comments about the person you almost didn't see. That's the one that counts. That's the whole thing, really. That was always the whole thing.